Howdy. Oh wait, I forget. Y'all don't do howdy here. I'm like behind enemy lines. Very nice to meet y'all. I'm Mason Smith, and a little background about me is I'm the founder and creator and like sole developer at Airdorf Games. And I'll talk a little bit about my titles, but I made a game called Faith. I released it in fall 2022, and I'm involved in a lot of other projects. I do work with New Blood Interactive, who does like Ultra Kill and Dusk and those types of games. Has anyone, by show of hands, has anyone played my games like Faith and stuff? So we got some Faith fans. All right. I was gonna ask if Andrew's here. My intern probably hasn't even played my game, but I'll have to ask later. Cool. Well, it's very nice to meet you. Besides, when I'm not making games, I'm teaching character animation, game design, and development at Texas A&M. I've been doing that for a little over 3 years, or almost, yeah, a little over 3 years. And it's really nice to meet you all. So what I'd like to do is kind of talk about like the crux of my, or like the topic of my talk, but I always think it's more fun if there's like Q&A and stuff. So think about questions and ask me them, and we'll have a good conversation by the end. Sound good? Sound good. First of all, games. I'll say that again. Games. One more time. Games. I consider games to be the ultimate creative medium. It's just about as close as to playing God as you can get, I think. And it encompasses so much, and there's a lot of pressure to make like a good game. And oh yeah, there's my intern who showed up late. There's Andrew, everyone. He's not my intern anymore. He's like full-fledged employee at New Blood. He works at New Blood. Um, he just walked in front of the camera. Yeah, cool. So, yeah, games, they're the ultimate form of creativity, in my opinion, because there's so much that you have to do to get it to work. And like we just had a terrific talk on just sound design and just how detailed and comprehensive it is. And it's going to be, frankly, a little hard to like follow that talk because I don't have like a live demo to show y'all. I wish I could make conjure a horror game in front of y'all, but live, but it doesn't work that way for me. But terrific talk. I learned a lot about sound design. Yeah, so games. Let's talk about my games. So these are some titles that I made. There's Faith, the Unholy Trinity in 2022, and then kind of interspersed of me working on that game, I did a bunch of like tie-in games for movies like The Wind and Hatching and Extraordinary. Two of those were commissioned by IFC Midnight. And quick story, all of those commissions came because I showed a game at Fantastic Arcade here in Austin, and the organizer like recommended me to the director of The Wind, Emma Tammy, and it just kind of spiraled from there. Spiraled has a negative. It created waves for my career. I recently made a point and click demo like adventure game with Molly Moon, who is a TikTok creator, and that was a great demo. Unfortunately, she pulled out of the project, and so it's kind of like stuck in space, but you can still play it. And then Earl's Day Off was like a fishing horror game that a buddy of mine made. And right now, I'm working on Tenebra Somnia, which is an Argentine survival horror game that blends old school survival horror gameplay with live action cutscenes. And I mean, like, really cool live action cutscenes. Like, this is a practical effect, this creature here. And then after you meet her in the cinematic, you like fight her in the game. Um, and so, like, this was like a practical effect. Like, how cool is that? So, the creature effects team for that game was the one that did the creature and gore effects for Where Evil Lurks. Have you all seen that? It was an Argentine kind of apocalyptic horror movie that came out. So I'm executive producer, making sure the trains run on time, and hopefully we'll get this released this year. But I'm really, really excited about it. And there's a glimpse of my latest game, that super secret game I'm working on. These are some horror games that I really like. So to kind of get a perspective on like my like bias and like what I'm really into. So I'm a huge fan of PT. PT is probably my all-time favorite horror game. I grew up playing survival horror games on the PS2s. Like Fatal Frame 2 is a huge example of, I think, immaculate horror design. And then I recently played Crow Country and Amnesia the Bunker last year, and then Lost in Vivo is one of my all-time favorites. And then, has anyone ever played Shadow Man? Yeah, Shadow Man Remastered by Night Dive, dude, it's great. It's like Voodoo Core Tomb Raider, where you like hunt down serial killers by hopping between Hell and Earth. And there's the Apocalypse, but that's like secondhand. And then Resident Evil, of course, I really, really love the remake. But that's kind of a glimpse into me. So I'm going to explain the slide. So these are so there's an issue. There's a problem, right, when you're creating a horror game because so much goes into it. And I think one of the principal problems is that you have to be a master at a lot of theatrics, storytelling styles. So a storyteller, an architect, a magician, a stripper, a taxi driver. This isn't a setup for a joke. These are like professions and mindsets that I think you have to be like all at once to be an effective horror game designer. Now let me explain the stripper part. So there's an expected payoff, right? And there's a teasing of the payoff, and I think that goes into managing scares and elements of horror in your game. And so it's like a all encompassing, I think, task to create a horror game that's really effective, in my opinion. And speaking of my opinion, a couple of caveats. So this is my personal design philosophy. So I'm not going to pretend that I know all the answers for how to make like a viral horror game or a horror game that's like really truly scary that'll make people poop in their pants. But I'm going to tell you about what's worked for me in my career. And so I'm heavily biased towards those titles that I really like in my style of horror. There are other styles of horror that are just as popular, if not more popular, than the product that I've made. And this is based on really limited experience and success. Like I've enjoyed success with Faith, but I think I have a long ways to go, like in my career. So um, what I'm saying isn't gospel, you know. And there are exceptions to everything I'm going to say, and I'm actually going to mention those exceptions. And so this might turn some of y'all off, but a lot of this is actually marketing and business related because I have the task now of supporting my family with my games, and so that stuff goes into it. And so I believe very passionately about the marketing side of games so that you can get this in front of people and they will pay for the thing that you worked really hard for and put your blood, sweat, and tears into. So let's move on. Yeah, so I want to start with some high level concepts for horror games. My number one high level concept, and it might seem really obvious, is that I'm here to scare you. Like, that is what I want to do. After all is said and done, I want you to be scared. I want you to have that pin prickly, hair raising, like cold sweats experience. There's a lot of problems to that. And one of them, which I talk about in my game level design class, is what's called immersive tendency. Has anyone heard of this phrase? That's because you just heard it in class last weekend. Oh boy. So immersive tendency is it's a psychological term that scholars use when they're studying things like immersion, engagement, and like game flow. Y'all heard of game flow and stuff. All right. So there's theories. The theory right now is that things like presence and immersion and engagement and embodiment, like projecting yourself into the game, you forget yourself, are all components of the flow state, the fun state of being absorbed in a game. But if you have low immersive tendency, all that stuff is going to matter like less because you don't have the biological capacity to be immersed. I have a high immersive tendency according to these scholars. So I will play a game or I will watch a movie and I'm like in the zone. Like I'm absorbing it. I'm in it. I'm in the world. I'm feeling everything. My wife, on the other hand, has very low immersive tendency, and so it takes so much to get her like out of herself and into the world of a TV show or a game. Well, she doesn't play games, but or like a movie. I took her to see Pacific Rim once, and she was like having a nosebleed. It was like way too much stimulus, and I'm like there, like I'm in the rain in my Jaeger fighting the kaiju, because that's like my jam. But she was very like she was not having it or she was not into it. And so you can try and you can create what you think is a super immersive game experience. But if you put it in front of the wrong person or the wrong audience, you'll get different results. I don't think it's because you failed as a human being who's trying to make horror games. I think it's just there are other factors. So again, these are like guidelines rather than the gospel. I love this quote. There's a couple of researchers that said this in a paper, some random paper I read, and I never forgot this statement, that the most provocative game design possibilities are found where the role of the designer as an advocate for the player is disrupted. When the role of the designer as an advocate for the player is disrupted. Have any of y'all played a game where you felt like you were playing against the game designer? Miyazaki, any Dark Souls fans in here? Yeah, so poison swamps are like his jam, And so, how many times have we played through like Bloodborne or a certain part where like Miyazaki, why did you put this enemy here? So I think that there's a playful, well, obviously there's a playful element to games, but I think there's a playful element in which the player engages in the performance and becomes a performer. Obviously, YouTubers and streamers, they perform while they're playing the game. But I think that you as the player are in on it with the game designer. There's actually a dialogue, a playful dialogue that exists between the game designer and the player. I believe very strongly in that. So when you're playing Faith or playing one of my games, you're kind of playing against me. And I like to take the role of this kind of like sort of sadistic haunted house designer that's like, watching you go into this room and being like, yes, yes, yes. Oh crap, they went the other way. They're supposed to go here. So play test your games in front of a lot of people, like you're doing upstairs. So I think that there's this moment where, as the designer, you want to make an engaging, fun, obviously, like dynamic game experience that really gets the player absorbed. But there's got to be a point, especially when you're making horror games, where you need to turn the tables on the player, or actually several points, and you need to kind of be their enemy, their tormentor for a little bit. But I want you to like, my high level mindset is that you're playing my game, but you're also playing kind of against me and with me in certain parts. And I'm taking you on a journey. I'm a taxi driver taking you from one spot to the next. And then this is my third high level concept that I kind of want to base everything off of. Is there's this in writing, there's a phrase like write what you know. And I agree with that. Like, if I'm going to adapt it to like horror writing and horror storytelling, and I don't consider myself a good storyteller. I've never taken a writing course. I've written like one script in my life, and they like rejected it outright. But um, I have a couple of ideas of how to tell a story in a horror game. But my biggest idea, like my high level like focus, is to focus on what scares me, and that's actually very specific. Like werewolves, meh, like okay. Zombies aren't really scary to me. Like it's thrilling to watch survival horror zombie media, but they don't really scare me. Like vampires even less. Did you? By show of hands, who saw Nosferatu, the Robert Eggers one? Did y'all like it? There's a couple of these. All right, cool. I liked it. I didn't find him scary, but I found him disturbing and like really intense, which was still a good movie in my opinion. So I want to focus on what scares me. So what scares me personally are like ghosts, or like J horror ghosts, like the clicky in your throat ghosts, like crawling down the stairs ghosts, stuff that can move through walls, stuff that can, the supernatural is something that's not supposed to happen, but it does happen. So things like that. So like paranormal activity is my jam. The Conjuring is my jam. Like as someone who grew up in a religious family and community, like the devil scares me, and like demons and things like that were very real to me and still are, and things like that. So I'm going to focus on what scares me. Thus, an 8-bit horror game about summoning demons and stopping a satanic cult. So, do we all know the three-act structure of Western storytelling? So we've got rising action, right? So if this is like a graph, can you all see my mouse? Yeah, indicating the intensity of the action and the goings on of the film. I like to do this thing where I borrow from the three-act structure for not just whole games, but like chunks of games. You know what I mean? And sometimes those chunks can overlap. So when I'm designing like a scary moment or like a vignette or like a moment in the game that is important, I will follow a three-act structure where we kind of go up in intensity, and then we get to rest a little bit, and then it gets a little crazier, and then we think everything's okay, and then it gets really crazy up here in the climax. But I bet y'all didn't know there can be a secret, devious fourth climax that's even worse. Like we see this all the time in movies, right? Sinister is a really notorious movie where they do the jump scare where his face just kind of shows up in the last frame of the movie. That would be like a not so effective example. But I believe in the devious fourth second climax. Um, and that's what I will typically do and structure my games around. In terms of storytelling, there's the concept of Chekhov's gun. So if you're watching a movie or there's a story and it mentions like a gun, or well, in this case, will be this old timey revolver, and or they show it, and the camera kind of zooms in on it a little bit, and then you don't see it for a while, but in the back of your mind, you're waiting for that gun to be used and to go off. So there's a setup and payoff kind of dynamic, which I utilize very heavily in my horror games. But there's a really interesting way to convey that or communicate that. I was watching a YouTube video by this YouTuber recently where he talked about what was the movie Caveat. Caveat's one of my favorite horror movies that I've watched in a while, and Oddity was the follow up. Go watch them. It has Chekhov's gun, but there's a part where you think the gun went off, but it actually didn't. We don't expect the gun to fire anymore because it seems it already has. So a lot of this is like being a magician, misdirecting and distracting, and having a stimulus over here when you're actually doing something over here to set up the next big thing. That's what I mean when I said you have to be a magician to be a horror game designer. There's a framework that I use for crafting scares, and a lot of the scares in my games are very handcrafted. Like if you've played Faith or watched it, it's a very narrative driven, not exactly totally linear, but there's a plot and stuff. And so there are these moments, and the thing with horror games is that when you're making like a story based horror game, it's like they play it once, and a lot of the stuff is kind of spoiled for them unless they do like Leon and Claire in Resident Evil. They kind of branch off into different paths, or there's different game modes and things like that. Lost in Vivo has hidden game modes that only unlock if you play the game after midnight, which I think is genius. So I like to so these like 3 act vignettes and these like little story moments and scares that overlap or encompass the whole game. I like to have them follow a simple framework, and that's priming, anticipation, and stimulus, which are expertly visualized with these emojis here. I don't know why they turned into a cat in stimulus, but it's fine with me. I like it. And this is adapted from a framework that was introduced by Nick Nocturne, who is a YouTuber that I really, really like. One, because of their velvety voice is just hypnotic. But they did this really cool video on Resident Evil 7 about how they kind of lure in a very genius way the player into these kind of states where they're anticipating something, and then there's a payoff, which is the scare. But the designers were really good at crafting something that you didn't expect, or something that you were expecting to come from here at this time at this moment, but they did something else. Dead Space is a great example of that. Oh, sorry. I'm going to spoil a lot of horror games today, so I'm really, really sorry, including my own. So I'm really sorry if you get spoiled. Don't at me. Um, so I have to spoil a part of Dead Space where they prime you, and get you to anticipate one specific scare, but the stimulus that scares you is something completely unexpected. So it kind of dances the line of like a jump scare without context and something that did have context. It's just the context was that it got you to be feel dread. Dread is like this like dreadful anticipation of what's going to happen. We feel dread when we're in a dark room and the power's off and we're like feeling our way through like a room. That expectation that something could reach out and touch us at any second. And so priming would be where you put something in the game that the player sees or hears or feels, like controller, like haptics wise. We don't have smell-o-vision yet on computer games, but it'll be once it happens, it'll be awesome. It's gonna be big. So no smells yet in games, but we can prime them with something that we show them or something that they hear, like sound design, and or something that communicates to us through the controller. Like maybe it starts like a heartbeat, vibration through the controller. And so that's the priming state. It makes you aware that something is out there. You don't have to tell the player what it is or where it is. You just have to let them know that something is. You know what I mean? So then they enter, if you've done it right, they enter into the state of anticipation. So this is where like atmosphere comes in. So Butcher's Creek, I just finished it this week, game by my good friend David Szymanski. If you haven't played it, you definitely should. The creator of Iron Lung, Squirrel Stapler, those games. Yeah, Squirrel Stapler, excellent. If you've played Squirrel Stapler, you'll enjoy Butcher's Creek because there's lore or overlap. You know what I mean? There's a part of that game that scared me to death. And I may be a horror game creator, but I'm actually really like because I have high immersive tendency, I get scared by horror games a lot. And it's actually really fun. Like I have a subcategory in my Steam library that's like games that scare me. And it's not like empty, like it's full. I love being scared in games. That's why I make these games. Um, and there's a part in Butcher's Creek that made me anticipate something that I was just dreading to encounter in the game. Because the game is a melee combat game, you can like throw things at enemies, but you have to get up close and personal with enemies. And it's very dark, limited visibility. But there was one level of Butcher's Creek that had me in this state where I was afraid to play. I almost had to do like I did when I played Resident Evil 7, where there was a part that was so scary, I had to leave my computer, go get therapy pizza, and then come back like 2 hours later, and be like, okay, I'm going to finish this part of the game. And then I'll talk about how a major scare in Resident Evil Village was spoiled for me with a YouTube thumbnail. Not that I'm still bitter, but so we got them in this anticipated state. So this is where, palm sweaty, mom spaghetti, all that stuff, and they're, you're expecting something. So what you've done is you've got them in anticipation of one specific thing or some specific category. This is like the fun zone for me as a horror game developer because now I can do anything with you because you're anticipating something. But again, I'm a magician. I'm a storyteller. There's twists and stories, and in some ways, I'm a stripper because I'm teasing a payoff to you and kind of putting it in front of you. And there's the expectation, and they're playing along with it. So the stimulus is actually not as simple as it sounds because you can that's the big scare, right? So that's the thing. It doesn't have to be a jump scare. There doesn't have to be a loud banging noise or orchestra hit, but you do need to show them the thing. So you've got them where they are cognizant of the thing, they're anticipating the thing, and now you're going to show them the thing. The fun is how and what exactly, where, and in what context you show them the stimulus. And this can be an hour later. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be like 5 seconds later when they're in the state of anticipation. So it requires a lot of testing and it requires a lot of like horror acumen from like reading books and like, your favorite horror media, having that internal library. But you'll eventually get in this zone, and I don't do it naturally. I do it with a lot of testing and iteration where you figure out when to do the payoff and how to show it and what exactly to show. Remember Dead Space, you're expecting one scare, and then you round a corner and this giant tentacle grabs you, and you enter this extremely panicky quick time event where you have to shoot the parts of the tentacle before it drags you into a hole. It's genius. Schofield, the game director, does a great interview on Ars Technica about the design of that specific scare. It's part of their War Stories series. Let's look it up. It's great. So priming, anticipation, and stimulus. This is how I structure scares in my games. Because I've been doing it for so long, it happens to me organically, but it is actually quite structured. I've just internalized the structure. So there are scripted ways to do this, and then there are unscripted ways to do this, and I'll give 2 examples. So a very famous scripted scare is the dog jumping through the window in the hallway in the first Resident Evil. And in the HD remake, they do it even better because the first time you go down that hallway, the dog does not come through the window. All right, so look at the priming. If you've already played Resident Evil, that's the hallway, and they know that they're going to jump through the window. Why, they'd be crazy not to put that scare in there. The first time you go down that hallway, something just hits the window but doesn't go through it. So now the player's like, oh, great, like any moment now, like, okay, maybe it's this window. Oh, maybe it's this window. Okay, I'm at the door to the next hallway. I guess I'll keep going. And so the priming is there. So whether you're a new player and you just heard something bang against the window, or if you didn't skip the opening cutscene, you know that dogs will come after you. And then in Resident Evil, if you try to leave the mansion as soon as you enter it, dogs will come out and come through the door and force you to close it again. So you're primed to expect dogs. You know they're out there, and they're not good boys. Uh, well, maybe they are, and it's just misunderstood. Um, but they look a little hungry. I mean, anyway, so you go down that hallway and you're primed, and then you get these like little primings because you get other stimulus like the something banging against the window outside that you can't see. And then eventually, after all this anticipation, and remember it's a horror game, so it's self-paced, so you could come back here an hour later, and then it jumps through the window. And then there's more to it in the remake where they expanded on that scare, which is genius. It's an incredible moment. Flash forward to Silent Hill 2 remake. Who's played it? Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I had my doubts about Old Bloober Team, but I was really, really like I loved it. Really cool. But they got these mannequins, and we got to talk about the mannequins because I have a problem with them. Big problem. So they managed to create an enemy in a horror game that like forces you to play very carefully, or else you're just gonna be really scared and punched in the face. They're actually really good like boxers. They're like MMA fighter mannequins. What the designers did was they crafted this enemy so they could hide anywhere. Like I opened a door in the game that was like a corner, and so the door opened this way, and I turned around, and it was in the space between the door. It was in that little corner. They somehow hid it there, and I didn't see it clipping through or anything. And they're really creepy, and they're perfectly still until you either shine your light on them and like, is that a? And then your flashlight blinks and they like come out and attack you, or they while you're not looking they come out and attack you. So that's like an unscripted systemic scare. So as a programmer, you can create enemies that have behaviors that are scary, and you can integrate the priming, anticipation, and stimulus structure in an enemy that's like it's just part of their nature, and then you just kind of let them loose. In Dead Space 2, there's these weird like I don't know how to call them. They're like mutated turkey necromorphs. Have y'all played it? They're the ones that peek out at you from around corners. They programmed these creepy velociraptor zombie things to like hide in the shadows, but before they attack you, they stick their turkey necks around corners and look at you. And then they charge out and they're really fast. So priming and they make these horrible noises. Priming, anticipation, stimulus, all encapsulated in the code and the behavior of a monster. I think that's amazing. I'm not a great coder, so I can't like do that yet, but I think this is a great example of like an unscripted, systematic or systemic scare that's like programmed in. But it's not going to work unless the stimulus is itself terrifying. I happen to think this monster is pretty freaky because I have high immersive tendency and things like mannequins that are moving. I share that trait with Markiplier. Can't stand mannequins. Fun fact, I'll talk about marketing in a second, but there were scares in Faith, the Unholy Trinity, that I programmed specifically to scare Markiplier, like him specifically. That's why there's a mannequin scare in chapter one, because I knew that. So a lot of my horror acumen comes from watching him since the Slender days, reacting to horror games. So a lot of my internal library is actually watching games rather than playing them. I can't afford like money wise and time wise to play them all. Like so I watch but I watched the reactions and I thought about like, what would Markiplier think if I put this in here? And it sounds a little creepy, but he is the first YouTube host or channel that I ever subscribed to. Like I've been with him for forever. And I got to meet him once on the set of the Iron Lung movie, which was a crazy experience. So I think this is a scary monster, and I was really glad that they put it in the game and implemented it in such a creepy way. Also, the hiding is not scripted. If you scare it off or it gets damaged, it'll like run into a room and hide somewhere. I don't know how they did it. It's incredible. Yeah, so narrative. So I'm not much of a writer. People often compliment Faith's story. It was never my desire to write a comprehensive like script for the game or like plot. Although I am reviewing the script for a movie now, for a Faith movie, and that's been interesting. But I haven't. I would never call myself like a writer for games, but I do believe in crafting the player's narrative. So in terms of narrative, there's the in-game narrative, like Mario must save Princess Peach. It can get really complicated, like a monster hunter for hire must navigate a brutal war between two nations, all while trying to find his long lost daughter figure while trying to stop the apocalypse and earning money by slaying monsters, The Witcher 3. So it can get really complicated. But then there's the player's narrative. Um, how many of y'all, when you played a game, made the comment, "Oh, I died," right? Like, y'all didn't die. Your player character did. So what's up with that? Well, we embody ourselves into the games that we play, and their story becomes our story. And so there's there's sort of a line, but it's blurred. But anyone who's played chess, a player narrative would be like, once I lost my queen, it was all over, or once they got to this part of the board and started doing all the special moves. I don't play chess. They started doing all their special attacks. It was all over. So that's the player's narrative. And this part can get really difficult because it requires you to like detach a little bit from your game, your baby that you're so passionate about and protective of, and be like, all right, what's really happening here? What are the play testers really going through? What do I anticipate a player or a YouTuber, a specific YouTuber, for example, going through in this moment? So you anticipate their moves, So you use language like the player thinks that sees something coming through the window, and so they go to that area where the window is. But while their back is turned, something comes through the door behind them, and that's the scare. So priming, anticipation, and stimulus. That's an example from Faith Chapter 1. And so when you put yourself in the player's shoes and you try to predict, but you're actually crafting what they're going to do, you can't control all the variables, right? Much less, you can't control the player's like reactions or whatever. But you can craft something where you're like, all right, go play, and you can kind of anticipate how things are going to go. So I believe in crafting the player's narrative, uh, and that's tied to gameplay. And I personally prioritize emotional impact above all because I'm trying to scare you, and then I will prioritize gameplay, and then the story will just kind of like happen. I believe in crafting stories that Wendigoon will do a 4-hour video about, you know, theorizing what your game is about. And that's, to me, that's more valuable than having a story that's extremely specific down to every little detail, because I personally like to keep people guessing. I read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft while I was working on Faith Chapter 2, and there's this thing called the unreliable narrator. It's a trope where the narrator is either going crazy or has gone crazy, and you find that out towards the end. Dagon is a good example of that. And so I don't. I want to leave it up to the player to kind of interpret things how they want. That's why I didn't really make Faith like super pro-religion or anti-religion or anything like that. Although I get fan mail from Catholics, devout Catholics, and atheists, and I get hate mail from devout Christians and atheists. And that's kind of like a point of pride for me, because it means I crafted a game that people are interpreting in their own way. I think that's a really interesting way to tell stories. So crafting the player's narrative, and that narrative can be second to second, minute to minute. It could be a matter of hours where you're crafting this experience that you want them to go through. Faith Chapter 2 was literally a digital haunted house where you're walking through and you're encountering things. That's how I structured it. Because I played a lot of The Evil Within before that, which is a very linear kind of survival horror game, and I was inspired by that. Oh yeah, so streamers and YouTubers count as players. And so again, I used my experience watching Markiplier, not afraid to admit it. Is that the bite of 87? If we have time, I'll talk a little bit about when I met him. But it was a great experience. I got to eat lunch with him and Amy and Chica and the other dog. I'm a bad fan. I don't know what the other dog's name is. Henry? Okay. Thank you, Andrew. um, so YouTubers and streamers count as players. And so I don't see anything wrong with getting into the headspace of Germa, or that's impossible, but of like Markiplier or Jacksepticeye or someone else, and being like, okay, what really, what do they really like? And then, make something just for them in your game. It's a great exercise in specific affect or emotional impact to put into a part of your horror game. And when I talk about affect and like emotional impact, some of y'all either don't like horror games or you've never played them or prefer other types of games. I think anytime you want to craft a game with an emotional impact in mind, you want them to feel something, whether it's a sense of adventure or excitement, or you just want to get their heart thumping, or you want them to feel like romance, or something like that. I think that you can kind of adapt my words towards like an emotional impact, but I will specifically talk about horror if you haven't figured that out already. So this is something that I strongly believe in, and something I talked about in one of my GDC talks, is to do something scary with every game mechanic. Does anyone recognize the game on the right? Lost in Vivo, Akuma Kira. It's an incredible horror game, one of my top five. So the save system in Alien Isolation. So you have to walk up to it and you have to hold this card. And there's a mechanic that lets you look around while you're waiting for the card to be read. You ever thought about why the developers just put that in there where you can look in your surroundings? So because the xenomorph in that game is systematically designed to be scary because it's a AI creature, there I would be willing to bet there's a part where you're saving and you take that gamble because it'll tell you if enemies are nearby. But you do it anyway, and you look to your left, you look to your right, then you look to your left, and it's down the hall, and you're like, "Crap! Do I cancel out the saving process, or do I keep going and take that risk?" I love that something as simple as just saving your game can turn into a horror moment. You've already been primed because in the story you see the xenomorph no matter what. You're anticipating it constantly through the game, but they can throw a stimulus at you that you never thought you'd encounter, which is I'm saving the game, I look over here, and boom, he's there. They told you, enemy nearby, But it's a genius move in my opinion. This one's a little more complicated. So in Lost in Vivo, the game um, it makes a fake debug message that says that you collected an item that you weren't supposed to collect. So you actually collect this corpse and it goes into your inventory, it shows up and stuff. And a debug message says collected, obj underscore Dr. Corpse dot obj or whatever, dot fbx actually. You should always be using fbx's. Um, and after a while, you'll do something and you'll see a bunch of error debug messages, and you're like, man, I thought Akuma Kira was a professional. Like, what's all these weird console messages? And the corpse disappears from your inventory, but it doesn't appear on the ground. And I'll just let the payoff. I'll just let you all experience the payoff for yourself. But it was amazing. I was in tears. But then they do this thing where the credits start rolling when you're on this elevator, but then your name and your Steam friends start appearing in the credits as victims. Like, wait a second, and then the music starts getting all rotten and rancid, and it's not the end of the game. It's so cool. So even something as mundane as watching the credits roll through your game can be a scary moment. Skin's tingling just thinking about it. I love it. So even if your game has like walk, uh, collect items, raise cross, for example, hypothetically, you can make even walking scary. There's a part in chapter 2 where you get transformed into another character, and even moving with the analog stick, it rumbles the controller and it plays a really creepy audio. So people that I've observed watching the game get like really freaked out. They're like, "Oh, what's going on?" So even something like that, it may seem cheap, but I just want to scare you. But I want to scare you any time I can, right? So turn every mechanic against the player, and this can happen with all sorts of games. There is no surfing horror game yet. Don't steal. But if there was, you could even make like paddling out to shore and like getting carried away by waves, like that system or that mechanic, scary in some way. And I can think of lots of ways that water can be scary. Um, so this is a really important one that I believe very strongly in. If you're a horror game designer, you're missing opportunities by not taking every mechanic and using it in some way, turning it on its head to give something unexpected and creepy to the player. And I can't give you specifics because again, we're magicians and storytellers and taxi cab drivers, and so it can get really abstract and it's personal to you, right? Because you should do what scares you. I think you should embrace like one-offs, red herrings, and unsolved mysteries in your games. Here's a little Markiplier. Did that tree just get up and leave? Reacting to this tree that gets up and leaves, and you never see it for the rest of the game. But the next room, it's full of that same tree sprite. So we go to the next room, and they're all that tree. So you're anticipating it, but there is no payoff. It's a little cruel, but I believe in having random things that happen just once and then you never see again. So that adds an element of mystery to your game universe where anything could happen and it creates more anticipation. Don't do it like all the time because then it's not a one-off anymore. It's a system of one-offs. You know what I mean? So there's a balance, right? Lots of testing. Oh yeah, Butcher's Creek. This is a screenshot of it. So yeah, there's a part in this game that teases something that I really thought I was going to see around every corner. And there's like footsteps where it's running off. It makes this creepy noise, and then the level ends, and I never see it again. I was like, thank you, David, for not making me see that thing. But the whole time I was like this, just waiting for it to be around the corner, or waiting for it like to spawn behind me. You know how games will do that, where you collect the key that's at the end of the hallway, and you're like, oh boy, I wonder what's gonna happen. What's up? A pre-question from the audience. Yes, I took that picture. Yeah. So excellent. So you can be primed to not expect a scare, and then the stimulus can be something, again, using every mechanic against the player. There's a very mundane mechanic that you get used to doing over and over in that game, and there's the one time where he scares you with it, and it's incredible. Butcher's Creek. House Beneviento in Resident Evil 8 or Village. So there's a thing in this house. It was very scary. It was spoiled for me. I was so excited to play this game. I stole a research laptop at my university because it had an RTX card, and I was going to play it. Sorry, guys. And I was really excited to play it. And then one day I go on YouTube, and it's the thing on a thumbnail with House Beneviento, the name, and then a YouTuber like going like in the corner, like there it is, and like, oh man, I was so mad. It got spoiled for me. It was still really creepy, but it's a part of the game that doesn't even work like the rest of the game. It takes your weapons away. You can only walk around and examine things, and things are happening, and it's a paranormal experience in a Resident Evil game. And barring the weird like Resident Evil 4 demo from a long time ago that had like possessed dolls, look it up. It's creepy. There's not a whole lot of supernatural stuff, but this is like, man, this is like ghosts. How are there ghosts in my Resident Evil game in this economy? Here, localized entirely within my laptop. And then remember negative space. So I took architecture classes, so I'm very interested in how spaces are crafted, styling spaces, like structuring spaces. So here's an image with a lot of negative space. Anything could be out here. And then you thought it would be something scary, but it was just a screenshot. Again, priming, anticipating. So negative space. So this is like 3D negative space. It's the end of the hallway, but they have these cool twists and turns. This is like an ill-fated PT clone called Allison Road that didn't really pan out. But here, the designer created this vista. They had it in mind, and they created it from the point of view of the player. It's a first-person game where there's these corners and stuff. So you're like walking down this empty hall towards the destination of the door, but there's stuff in between, and you don't know what's behind that stuff. And so again, anticipation. There's also negative space in terms of sound design. So I firmly believe in having at least one part of your game where there's no music and hardly any ambient music or tracks. You create the ambient track because there's like a reverb. Oh man, I love that stuff. Doom mods do that all the time. There's this game called Siren that does it really well. And so I firmly believe in audio negative space where there's loud moments and there's quiet moments. And you're anticipating the loud moment because you've never encountered a quiet moment in this game before. One notable exception is like Five Nights at Freddy's 2, where the game does not let up for the entire experience. There's like the little Atari cutscenes. Imagine putting Atari graphics in your horror game. And those are kind of quiet, but the game's pacing is insane. It never lets up. And then you got to create the atmosphere. So sound, lighting, post-processing, fog, whatever you got to do. So in Dead Space 2, you go back to the USS Ishimura, which was the ship from the first one, except you don't encounter anything on it for like the first 10 minutes. But this is the game where you encountered all these necromorphs in the first time. Now it's totally empty. And so there's some insane anticipation. But I love Dead Space because if you leave the controller like idle and just stand there, you'll start hearing whispers. and you'll hear Isaac's name, the main character's name, like in the whispers. But sometimes it's just someone reading like an IBM manual, like they're just saying technical stuff. But it's really, really creepy. And it's like, yeah, a bunch of ghosts of a bunch of scientists would be reading from the IBM manual. And then Amnesia the Bunker is an incredible systems driven horror game that has, I think it had a scarier monster than Alien Isolation. They managed to do that. Um, there's incredible atmosphere. It even breaks the safe room rule, but in a way that you wouldn't expect. So you know how Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 can't go into save rooms. He'll politely let you do your thing, and then he'll go off and do something else. He'll do his own side quests. Ever think about that? Um, Maybe he's got to get groceries. But sometimes that safe room can be violated, and it's you have to be really careful with that because then the player will either keep playing or stop playing because that was like their one, their one solace. Amnesia the Bunker is great because the flashlight. So you're trying not to make any noise, or else this monster will hear you, come out of the walls, and drag you and kill you. It's really easy to get killed in this game. But the flashlight, your one source of light, is a loud crank up, like wind up flashlight. So every time you want light, you have to make noise, and it's incredible. Amazing atmosphere. You're in the middle of World War I, so like shells are still like hitting the ground above you, so it's shaking, and you're hearing stuff. There's even parts where I swear I heard someone tapping on a wall, and I can't confirm if that was just me going crazy. Again, immersive tendency, or the game like programming that in, and I couldn't tell if it was systematic or if it was scripted. And that's a great feeling as a designer to have that kind of reaction. Atmosphere. So it's like I don't have time in this talk to tell you how to create atmosphere. I'm just going to tell you create atmosphere. Push the atmosphere button in Unreal, and you're good to go. Has anyone played these games? That's all right. There's a lot of horror games out there. Um, this one's called Darkfall: The Journal, and it's a point and click game where ghosts like talk to you and stuff, and it's kind of cool. You get to wear like ghost goggles and like check them out at the end of the game. But there's this long hallway that you have to go down all the time, and it creates this great sense of anticipation. Also, there's no background music in the game, so everything is dead silent, and you're in an abandoned hotel. And this one is Lamentum. I really like this area of the game where there's rain and thunder and stuff. And there's like this vignette, so you can't really see a lot of like enemies creeping up on you. All right, so some last minute tips before I open it up to just a couple of questions. You gotta know the media, right? So play and watch lots of horror. You don't have to go out of like the genre of stuff that you like. Like if you like werewolf movies, then watch a lot of werewolf movies by all means. But branch out into other stuff, you know. And then so what I did is I watched a lot of like those like number 15, what paranormal videos, it's like this person did not expect a ghost to pop out of his closet. Let's see what happens. I get scared by that stuff because again, high immersive tendency. Like I get scared, but I like it because it's like real. Like you get this like sensation. It's like, oh man, is this real or fake? I think a lot of it's fake, and AI is just going to ruin like my experience with like paranormal videos. But I like to believe that it's real. Dolls that move on their own. That's like the ultimate for me. If you want me to play your horror game and get scared, put a doll that looks at you. You can try writing down your scares or like telling them to someone. And if you're telling someone about your game, like a scary part, and you had that experience that I had recently with where like I was getting all worked up and like my skin was kind of crawling, maybe you've got something. Like put that in the game and test it out. Oh yeah, the Uncanny Valley. Y'all are familiar with that. So analog horror. So like everything has to have like highly realistic eyes and like a mouth that stretches open. So like there's a reason why that's so popular because we're programmed to like this isn't purely scientific, but you can imagine that we were programmed, from the early days to be afraid of things that look human but actually aren't human. Kind of makes you think. So the uncanny valley is a very like basic psychophysiological response to certain stimuli, and I think it should be explored more. I always use constraints in my game design, but putting constraints on the player. And I don't mean necessarily like taking all their weapons away halfway through the game, although you can do that. There's parts where that works. But like confined spaces, or you're in a big room, but there's a giant conference table, so you're actually pretty limited, or something like that. And emphasizing vulnerability, I think, is a really good way to make the player like kind of panicky and scared. And then remember, it's a game. You can put anything in it. I put a walking tree. I put an ent, like a Tolkien ent, in my horror game about like demons and the satanic panic. But it was really fun to do so, and I got a really great reaction out of my target audience from it. Oh yeah, here we are at the end. Thank you very much. I got a few minutes for questions. Oh yeah, these are my socials. Feel free to bug me. Gary loves you. Always remember that. All right, questions. What do you got?
Do you have any examples you can share of times where, while working on your own game or playing your own game, you unexpectedly scared yourself?
Yeah, so I had nightmares throughout the production of Faith, the Unholy Trinity. So I kind of got into a loop. It was weird. And then I had my wife sit down and play, and she's like, okay. And so, like, again, immersive tendency. But um, yeah, I accidentally multiplied a monster by 1,000 to spawn from the outside of the screen. Um, that was pretty cool. I didn't put it in the game, but it was insane. Crashed the game, which is even scarier when you're a developer. So yeah, there were plenty of times, when you're testing and stuff. I had my doubts. So like, if any of y'all have watched EGoRaptor's like sequelitis series, when you're making a sequel. So when I was making Chapter 3, I was getting so in my head and in the weeds of like the development that I didn't know what was scary anymore. And so thankfully I had a support group in the guys at New Blood. So we would do our weekly meeting and I'd show them my new stuff. And if one of them was like, hey, Airdorf, question, what the F is wrong with you? Like after showing them something, then I knew I'd done my job. Um, but the challenge with that is that I've always had maintained control over my IPs. So like Dave Aucrey will give suggestions, David Samantha will give suggestions. And I can follow them or not. So you kind of have to like trust yourself. But yeah, every now and then there's like accidents, like multiplying an enemy by 1,000 that scare me. But because I'm so susceptible to horror media, it was pretty easy for me to be like, all right, this is right. Like this is where I want it to be, and you just kind of have to trust yourself. So Mark Brown, who does a lot of game design videos, yeah, they do Game Designer's Toolkit. I love this quote. I'll never forget it. He says, rather than making a game that you think a lot of people will like, you should be making a game that you know a few people will love. That's when you get a very dedicated, passionate audience. And so the chances are whatever scares you is going to scare them, and that's who you're going to bring over. Great question. Anyone else? Yes. How do you deal with lows? Or do you just like not deal with it at all? Well, I love her very much, and I'm patient with her. I'm just kidding. I didn't want this talk to be about my wife, but so you're talking about the low immersive tendency. There's some things, like I said, some factors that you can't control. The very first review for Faith was a 1-star review because he didn't like how slow John Ward, the main protagonist, walked, and he didn't like how the bosses were all one-hit KOs, and I never changed it. So my first review was a 1-star. So if I stopped there, I wouldn't be here. But you can't please them all, and you can't win them all. That's why games that I think are perfect have negative reviews. So your audience, like I said, your audience is actually going to be pretty small if you've done all these things. But I like it that way. It's a little more intimate, and I get to connect with my fans a lot more. And like word of mouth kind of grows from that. It kind of grows organically rather than trying to please everyone. So I kind of don't deal with it. I deal with it by moving on and focusing on the people I know I can scare. I hope that answers your question. Great. Anyone else? You mentioned like yes. Reaching out to the people who play games. Oh, that's a trade secret. Why should I tell you? Okay, I'll tell you. So when I first created Chapter 1 of Faith and put it on itch.io, I didn't do any marketing. And I've never paid a cent for exposure on social media, by the way. I kind of think that's a little iffy, but well, no offense if you have done it. I just been very blessed to have a very supportive marketing team and have not gone viral, but had people like Markiplier play it. So how did I do it? I figured out that Markiplier or his team were taking off of the front page of itch.io. So I tried really hard to put Faith up there with like updates and stuff and social media posts to kind of boost its visibility. But Markiplier has a subreddit where you can suggest games to play. And I swallowed my pride, and I basically like came in and was like, Markiplier, will you please play my game? I love you, and I've been subscribed to you for forever. And it eventually happened. It didn't happen right then and there, but it eventually happened. I have no idea if anything I did actually worked, or if it was in his queue. You know, it's just a long queue. But he did eventually play all three chapters, and that was one of the proudest moments in my career. It brought tears to my eyes. He actually played The Wind before he played Faith, and I was really frustrated about that. But he had some really great things to say, and it was really encouraging to me. Um, like you can always ask. The worst that'll happen is that they say no. You know, I suppose worse things can happen, but if they're like really nasty. But if you just ask, I did a lot of cold emails to small time YouTubers. I went on their about page on their YouTube channel, and there's like a business email, and sometimes those work, sometimes those don't. But like sending an email is free, you know. Other than that, I've tried to cultivate a really strong presence on Twitter, like a really interactive kind of presence. And so, just by being friendly, you know, and sliding into DMs when I could, you know, just asking and cultivating relationships. So I have friendships that I have grown and nurtured with, you know, influencers that have become business associates of mine or have agreed to cameo in my games that are now unannounced, but maybe someday. And so it's kind of a whole. It's kind of like an art and a talent to network, but create relationships, not create opportunities to ask for things. I hope that answers your question. There's a lot of outlets. Business emails only work half the time because sometimes they're just dummy emails, you know, and people have gatekeepers, right? So I don't know how to contact Mark Fishbach like directly. I just got extremely lucky, and then I had the great experience of getting to meet him. Um, so I hope that answers your question. You just got to try and ask, you know. So we got like 3 minutes left. Maybe I can talk a little faster.
In terms of like sound design, how much do you think about like diegetic sound effects versus using non-diegetic as a scaled player?
Oh yeah. The Wee Wah Wah Wah? Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm familiar with the Wee Wah Wah Wah. Yeah. Um, Great question. So I firmly believe in the in-world audio, although there are always exceptions. Music is a great exception. So like Silent Hill 1, when you're in the elementary school, has a music track where like nothing is happening, but it's like the craziest thing you've ever heard. There's like buzzsaw blades going off, and like, you know, it's like does anyone remember the band Stomp? They're like banging on trash cans and like, okay, it might have been before. Oh boy. But they use like garbage to make music, and it's like real clangy and stuff, and that stuff's going on, and that's really entertaining to me. But like the sound of a monster, you know. So there's a mechanic of the player hearing stimuli in the game, you know, accessibility issues, you know, to the side. So those who can hear, they can, you know, the act of hearing in the game is a mechanic, and you're supposed to turn those mechanics against the player. So every single noise in your horror game needs to be unsettling, down to the menu like stuff. Outlast 2 has a terrifying main menu. So does Dead Space 1. And but there's always an exception where there's like non-diegetic or like, you know, sound like stingers and stuff. I tend to stray away from stingers. What I really like is a stinger that is part of the environment. Like in Signs, where Mel Gibson whips around and he sees an alien leg going into the cornfield, and the wind suddenly starts picking up and rustles all the corn. Ooh, man, that's a great moment. So they used a natural environment cue to create the jump scare co-stimulus, the sweetener, if you will. I learned a new term today. So that's my answer to that question. My personal bias is in game universe stuff. But if you can kind of use it creatively to use it as non-diegetic, I think there could be some interesting things there. Okay, one more question, I think. Yes.
I just wanted to say that I found you.
Oh, you found me?
Yeah,
Okay, I alerted the FBI. I hope you know.
I know.
It was just a joke. Okay, cool. Well, very nice to meet you. Let's talk after this. Okay, maybe one more then.
Do you have any tips on like how to make a good environment besides like negative tips and stuff? Because like when it comes to setting like stuff like Crow Country,
Oh yeah.
so, you know, that environment just like captures me like at sight. Do you have anything like to
Yeah, so from the space side, architecture in my opinion is about like hierarchy and movement. You know, if you studied Frank Lloyd Wright, who did no Frank Lloyd Webber. One of them was an architect. One of them wrote music for. Yeah, I was right, right, right. So he created religious architecture like churches and cathedrals. That was all about the narrative. Like he took you by the reflecting pool to reflect on your mortality. He put you in these entrances where everyone comes from different sides into one space. So it's unity, of the church, and then you come into this great cathedral where it's very narrative driven. So I think studying architecture and really understanding the philosophy behind why we built things the way we built them. Gothic architecture, it's all over the place in games because it's really cool looking, but you kind of have to know the theory behind it. So they found a way to stack blocks vertically because of our hubris of wanting to approximate ourselves to God. It started with the Tower of Babel, which ended badly, and now Gothic architecture, where our hubris takes us as close to the heavens as we physically can, but we cannot get there fully. And you get these really austere shapes and stuff, which are reflective of how of stuff that was going on with religion back then in the Dark Ages. Dark Souls is a great example of using Gothic architecture the way it was conceptualized. So studying architecture, and then you kind of have to be an interior designer when you're making games. Crow Country, every object, every monster, and the monster placement is architecture. It is part of the space, because if there's combat involved, then where you put the monster, even if there's no combat involved, like Outlast, when you're running from things, um, they are part of the space because they could block a doorway, and you got to figure out how to kite them away and get to the doorway. So every object in your game, regular architecture is built with bricks and cement. We build architecture with computer code, and every entity in the game is part of that architecture. So kind of find an architectural theory that you really like and try it out. Cool. I think that's all the time I have, but I'll be like walking around if you want to say hi. Thank you all very much for listening and for your participation.